Welcome. I'm Nolan Dalla, and we're here to discuss the economic impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, as well as the nationwide social distancing and even quarantining in many large metro areas of the country. So far, much of what we've seen in the mainstream media is focused primarily on how to protect ourselves and so forth and so on, and according also the political debates that we're so used to. But we've not heard so much about what's happening to real people, workers and their families, and larger scale economies. And I have two guests here with me that are, I think, ideally suited to discuss that very topic. I'd like to be mindful of working people and a lot of people that will be watching us who really are suffering and worried about the future as we discuss some of the questions and topics tonight, and how we can prepare ourselves for what could be some very tough times ahead. With that said, allow me to introduce my two special guests. If you're looking at my screen, on the bottom, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but on the bottom below us is Dr. David Croson. He's an associate professor of economics at Michigan State University and a senior fellow at the Wharton Financial Institutions Center. He holds a doctorate in business economics from Harvard University and 2 degrees from Penn State University. Dr. Croson also served on the staff at the National Science Foundation. My other guest here is Larry Greenfield. He's a longtime wealth advisor based in both Los Angeles and here in Las Vegas, which is where I am. And he's a distinguished fellow at the Claremont Institute. He holds a political science degree from UC Berkeley, as well as a law degree from the Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. Larry has also served in naval intelligence. He's also very active in Republican Party politics. He was the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Foundation. So thank you to both of you, my special guests.
Thank you. Are you sure you meant us? You said you wanted real people, and tonight we're just virtual.
All right, gentlemen, let's get right to it, shall we? Today, President Trump's chief economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, came to the microphone at the press conference. And he announced the total stimulus package could amount to a grand total of $6 trillion. That's with a T. That's big money. A figure that's unprecedented in all of American history. Let me get both of your reaction to that really startling figure and that announcement today. We'll begin with you, Dr. Croson.
Okay. Well, obviously, 6 trillion is a huge number, literally an astronomical number. We have to remember, though, that when we're talking about government stimulus, it's not like that $6 trillion just gets pumped into the economy and then it vanishes, right? It gets paid to people in wages. You know, you buy computers with it. It turns into capital. Materials are purchased and so on. A good deal of that 6 trillion is going to find its way back into the government coffers once all's said and done. And so really, we should be looking at what the net cost is of this stimulus package, as opposed to what the initial price tag looks like. But it is sobering that something as big as that might be necessary.
Larry?
I agree. I think it's easier to think about it by breaking it down. Some 1 or 2 billion of that are direct checks to individuals. Actually, if you file your taxes electronically, money is just going to show up in your bank account. If you file taxes by mailing in a check, they're going to mail you a check. That only applies, by the way, and we haven't seen the final version of the stimulus bill. It only applies to people based on their 2018 tax return and tax year. And it doesn't apply to people who are very wealthy or who had high incomes.
So Larry, why is that? Why are they using that arbitrary 2018 as the basis of benefits or stimulus?
Right, because 2019 calendar year taxes haven't even been paid yet. So they had to go to the prior year where they have records of what your income was. So it represents your income through December 31, 2018, which was on your 2018 taxes. Your 2019 taxes for 2019 income were meant to be filed by April 15th. So another little item in this big package would be you don't actually have to file taxes now until July 15th. Another little item, for example, might be no required minimum distribution They're talking about that. We'll see if it's in the final bill. So for those who are 70, now 72, based on the law change in December of 2019, for those who are required to take a little bit of money every year out of their 401k or their IRA savings in retirement, they won't have to take that money in 2020. Why that might be good is because you actually had a high value of your account at the end of December 31, 2019. Now that account is lower in value, but they're using the higher value to penalize you, to require you to take your own money out, which they tax. So for those retirees who know what required minimum distribution is, you may not have to worry about that in 2020.
Larry, I can see why you're an investment advisor.
Well, but no,
Larry, you're right.
To your question about why are they using 2018, I think we're going to see this theme showing up, which is for a very large-scale government intervention like this, they have to go on pretty hard data that they know down to the last dollar. They can't really speculate on what people's income was on 2019. They can't do it on an 80 or 90% sample for people who have filed early. They really have to know. It's going to be that same way for estimating what's going on the health side and figuring what's going on the employment side. They have to work with data which are kind of set in stone at this point, not subject to revision, even though they recognize they may not be the freshest and most relevant data that are available.
Very good. Larry Greenfield, you're an enthusiastic advocate of small government and free markets. I don't know your position on the 2009 stimulus bill and what happened, with the crash back then. But are these measures, big, gigantic stimulus package? Are these measures you can support?
Yes, for the most part. I think of it as the Federal Reserve, which took all kinds of extreme actions, not just lowering interest rates to zero, but all kinds of supporting by buying corporate bonds, the bond market, and injecting money into short-term banking activity and supporting the business community and the flow of money. So the Fed is one. Number two would be Congress and the stimulus bill we're expecting. I think we all learned lessons. I don't expect a lot of just giveaways or bailouts of big business. They're talking about bridge loans. They're talking about lines of credit. And I'm hoping that it is more of, you'll pay us back, but we want to keep people employed. We don't want to lose Boeing, are really the only aircraft maker, and all kinds of other important businesses. Every business is important to me. Everybody who's got a job is important to me. So I don't actually lean toward Wall Street. I actually lean toward Main Street. But I do think a lot of the stimulus bill from Congress will be Main Street oriented.
Yeah, there's a big debate, David, about Main Street versus Wall Street. And that's really the tug of war that we're seeing in the halls of Congress as we speak now. By the way, by the time people watch this, perhaps the stimulus bill will have been passed and even signed. But let's just assume that there is going to be a stimulus bill. Talk about Main Street versus Wall Street.
Well, so, the effects of these stimulus bills are going to be quite different for big firms, for Fortune 500 firms, than they are going to be for small firms. And this can actually be potentially good for small firms, but maybe not as obvious that it could be good. So one of the things that we have to realize is that in the first quarter of 2020, we actually had a fairly good GDP growth. I mean, before things started to unravel, which they certainly have, right, towards the end of February, the beginning of March. And the labor market was very tight. It was very difficult for small businesses to actually find qualified people and to hire them and to bring them on. And so, to some extent, small businesses could benefit if there is some level of contraction, because they will have more qualified people who are available to be hired. And although this might be a little bit morbid in order to think about it in terms of business failures, it may be the case that some marginal competitors are actually going to be pushed out of the market, which is going to give some pricing flexibility to other places. If there are two pizzerias in town, right, and one of them decides to close, then the other one is going to do better once it reopens, right? Not only will it have better access to workers, but it'll have more customers and be able to raise its prices a little bit and potentially be more profitable. And so if that stimulus money, can be captured in some way by small and medium-sized businesses, and it doesn't go only to, say, the top 100 companies in the US, this could actually be a stimulus to economic growth and not just recovery of something that we've lost already.
Let me run this question by you, gentlemen. We talk about what does it mean to be wealthy in America, or who deserves how much money, or, you know, in other words, how are we going to tie people over? I've heard arbitrary figures such as $95,000 a year, 50,000, and we've seen all kinds of figures. I'd like for you to practically discuss this. What if you're sitting there and you make, I'm just going to make this up, let's suppose your household makes $97,000 a year, and the cutoff for any kind of stimulus is only 96,000 and below. Mm-hmm. I mean, are there going to be revolts, or, I mean, you know, how do you, do we see maybe a graduated or gradual scale of how people get money? I mean, how could you have what are called very austere cutoffs, such as we've heard proposed? Which one of you would like to take that one?
I'll be glad to go first. So actually, the tax rates punish people at the marginal dollar that they earn. So we already sort of have a system where you make the cutoff or you don't. I'm a big fan of compromise and sharing these burdens. So why don't we make trades? If you have high income in 2018, your tax rate's already higher, and you're not going to get the check maybe. Maybe your kids get it. I'm not quite clear whether your kids get it because their income wasn't high. But maybe we lower the tax rates for everybody for a year or two. Or maybe we lower capital gains tax rates as a way to say to every American, you may still have equity in your home. Now you were thinking about downsizing because you can't afford it as much anymore. So you don't have to pay taxes on the capital gains in your home. Or maybe we'll lower income tax rates. So I would be in favor of fairness and compromises. So the wealthy don't feel like everything went just to the poor person and I worked so hard and I didn't get anything out of this. So shared burdens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Larry, I noticed you had to put in your pork in there for the capital gains. I know you've been arguing that for a long time. Here's your chance. What do you say, David?
Yep.
So David, can I just do 10 seconds on the capital gains tax? So I'm willing to be challenged, and there's probably a compromise here, but to stake out my ideological position, if you work and you earn money and you pay tax on that earnings and you save some of it, and then you invest in a house or a business, you're helping the economy. You may lose and you may win. I'm not a big fan of then taxing you on the gains. And I know you get to offset your losses on other projects you had, other investments, other risk, but I don't like capital taxes. That's my case.
All right, your 10 seconds are up. They were way up 20 seconds ago. What do you say, Dr. Croson?
We could have a whole nother discussion about that. So I think there is a big difference between providing liquidity to people who really need it in order to tide them over, and providing, you know, a really large redistribution of money. And when we're talking about trillions of dollars, it is, you know, inevitably large. I would support the idea that says some people really need checks in order to go into their bank account because they have bills that they need to pay in the next month or two. A critique about giving those checks to people with higher incomes is that higher incomes are correlated with higher net worth, and higher net worth is correlated with, rather than consuming that $1,000 or $2,000 or whatever it's going to be, that money would be invested. If your goal is to make sure that the money is not invested, by no means should you give it to people in higher incomes. On the other hand, if you want money to flow back in and to be available for growing businesses, and you want the stock market to potentially recover, and you want to give people the opportunity in order to buy low, given that they forgot to sell high, providing that money to people who are in, you know, the bottom 80% of the tax brackets is not really going to do that much in order to cause a restoration of confidence in the markets. And so, you know, there's no free lunch as far as that goes. I would be in favor of something saying, we're not dropping money into your account right now, but we'd give you a $2,000 tax credit in 2022 or something like that, where you say you're eventually going to get it. You're effectively helping other people who need that cash right now, but it's not something that you're going to miss out entirely on because you happen to make a few dollars too much back in 2018.
I fully endorse that as a incentive to get the velocity of money flowing in the economy. Absolutely.
Right, and I would support some kind of graduated phase out as well. It would be terrible to have made $22 too much and to miss out on the whole thing. That just doesn't make any sense.
All right, gentlemen, let me let our viewers and people listening know what's happening. We're here with Dr. David Croson and Larry Greenfield. We're talking about the economic impacts of the coronavirus crisis. We're going to be talking here for the next 15, 20, 30 minutes or so. We're going to, at the end of the show, we're going to talk, we're going to take some questions from some of the people on Facebook who knew that you two were on and wanted to get their questions in. Then we're going to also have what I call a lightning round of very quick questions that'll go to you. We'll only have a few seconds to answer. So we do have a lot ahead. Stay with us, and we'll continue now with another question here, David. Let's continue with talking about productivity going forward. We don't really know how long social distancing will last, but it's certainly going to take a toll, and likely a very big one at that. How much of an economic contraction can we expect over the next? I want to give you a timeline here.
Mm-hmm.
How much contraction can we expect over the next month, and then maybe quarter, and maybe even want to talk about 2020?
Okay. Well, so I looked at a survey of what people thought was going to happen. This is not really my area of expertise in economics. I'm more on the firm-to-firm competition and entrepreneurship side. Goldman Sachs is predicting something about a 6% GDP loss. It's 24% on an annualized basis, but you're talking about losing 6% just in quarter two. That's a big oof, right? That's like 2 years worth of growth that we're taking two big steps back on. And so, I think that that's a reasonable kind of estimate given what we're seeing. It's not the social distancing, which is so expensive. It's the enforced shutting down and the reduction of opportunities in order to actually, trade goods and services with each other, which causes that economic loss. And so, it's not having to take out your food from restaurants, which caused the problem. It's not being able to go to work in the first place. Now, that being said, it won't even be a recession until we have GDP growth going down for 2 quarters in a row. And the first quarter was actually up, right? So, it's so easy to forget this. The second quarter is going to be really terrible. It's going to be a bloodbath. There's going to be a huge write-off of lots of stuff. But if the third quarter is even plus 0.1%, we will have avoided any kind of recession. And so it's more like getting punched in the gut. It hurts, but it only happens once. We're not going to get hit repeatedly over and over again with this problem. And if it turns out that COVID-19 turns out to be a pandemic with really serious levels of prolonged hospitalization and fatalities and reinfection and things like that, we're all going to have more to worry about than what our 401k or Roth IRA balances look like. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that in the third quarter, although we will have been set back about 2 years worth of growth, we'll be back on a reasonable path to actually improve going forward.
Larry, I'd like you to take what David said, but I want you to add something as well. Who do you think is going to be hardest hit by this crisis? And I don't mean medically speaking, but in terms of the economic impact. Who's really going to suffer here coming up?
Well, in terms of pain, those at the bottom, those who can't get to a doctor or are living alone and are depressed and maybe even sick, those who were suffering from something else and this exacerbated it, those who were living paycheck to paycheck, those who are really struggling economically and won't get their job back because their employer went bust. 16 million Americans work in the restaurant industry. It's the largest employer. I can't imagine they're all going to have jobs waiting for them. In terms of amount of loss, though, then the rich people are going to lose the most money because their house value went down the most, or their stock portfolio went down the most, or companies lost the most on paper in the short term in terms of the value of their company. So pain is going to be widespread, that's for sure.
Does anybody come out, I don't want to say ahead, that maybe there's a bad thing to say, but what about the medical companies and firms that we've heard a lot about? Obviously retailers, Walmart and shipping companies, Amazon and so forth. There is a bright side to this at all?
Yeah, so if you don't mind my going first. So you've named a few, absolutely. Amazon Prime and e-commerce generally, and maybe Roku and Netflix and Disney in terms of the subscription models, not Disney in terms of people going to their parks, which are closed, and delays on their new movies. So absolutely, they're going to be winners. Telehealth, right? Telemedicine, they're talking about Zoom. We're using Zoom right now. Mm-hmm. There are definitely stocks and companies and ideas. I bet book sales will go up. Well, at least book writing is going to go up over the next 6 months. Book reading is going up over these months. So I'm thinking a lot about winners and losers. The other thing I wanted to say to build on the productivity question, so you got to separate the economy from the stock market. And by the way, disclaimer, I'm not giving stock advice. Okay, I'm not allowed to, and I'm not giving stock advice. Call your own financial advisor. Everybody's situation is different. Your time horizon, your risk tolerance, got it? So everybody call your own advisor. But the question, Nolan, is what will be the letter or the shape of the economic recovery? Assume we have an economic recovery. Will we have an L? We fall hard and then we flatten out. And it's a really miserable, long recovery, if at all. Will it be a U? We're down and then we suffer for a long time and then we come back. Will it be a W? We go down, we come up, but we go down again, maybe because the virus comes back or there's a second big problem in the world. Remember, we're having an energy problem right now too. The whole energy sector is being hammered by the Saudi, Russian flooding the world with oil at a time when demand is low. So more supply, less demand. They're having a fight for market share. It's crushing our and every other, rig count. So that would be a W, down, up, down again, and then maybe up. Or we all hope for the V for victory. We go down sharp, we recover sharply, maybe not to where we were, the all-time high in the market on February 20th, 2020, for a long time, I would suspect, but maybe a nice recovery economically, economic growth, productivity, people back to work, people feel better. Maybe we even feel really better that we came through, unified and beat the virus.
Any points of agreement or disagreement, David?
Well, I think it's important to do a little bit of quantification about how these work, right? So the US labor force is about 160 million, 170 million people. And the CDC's estimate of the upper end of fatalities, if absolutely nothing were done about the virus outbreak, is about 1.7 million. And so, I can divide that in my head. That's about 1% of the US workforce. Now, not everybody who's affected by COVID-19 would be in the workforce. Some are older, right? Some are younger, right? Some are in school, et cetera. But just to kind of as an order of magnitude, work with me on this 1% number. If we had the very worst thing happen and we had a permanent 1% reduction in the labor force of the United States, we'd expect that would result in a permanent 1% or so reduction in GDP, right? That's just kind of all there is to it. And if there were a 1% reduction in GDP, I could go to somebody like Larry and say, hey, if you knew this was going to happen, what do you think that's going to do for the stock market? And he would say, well, it's going to happen. It's going to be more than 1% decline in stock prices, but it's not going to be 30%, right? You say it might be 6, 7, 8%. Mm-hmm. So when I look at that, I say, the pain and suffering, which is going to be caused by the disease, is going to be, personally felt, right? It's going to be felt by victims of the disease. Certainly there is going to be pain and suffering, and there's going to be death. But that does not mean that the economy has to collapse, right? When we come out of it, right, once we're able to actually go to work and spend money, the total amount of damage which is done to the economy is going to be a lot less when we add it all up at the national level than it is when we think about the individual pain and suffering which is happening at the local level. And I think that's really important to understand in the long term. We're going to come out of this saying, wow, that was really terrible. Right? We lost, 2 years worth of economic growth, but we didn't lose decades worth of economic growth. And that's really important to think about, past the next 2 quarters.
Larry, President Trump yesterday spoke to the dangers of the so-called the cure being potentially more harmful from the virus than the virus. I believe what he was getting at was that shutting down sectors of the economy and quote unquote overreacting in certain geographies of the country where the pandemic has not at least surfaced quite as severely, it could hurt, this is their perspective, could hurt far more people and families than any risks posed by the virus. Do you think we can be too cautious here? And by the way, I don't expect you to answer that medically. None of us are qualified in that way, but let's talk about economically. Do you think they can be too cautious at the top of it?
Yes. In a perfect world of perfect information and outstanding decision making, maybe it would have been better to have a 2-week or a 3-week lockdown and economic devastation in February instead of March. My theme was all along, so the healthcare system is about 17% of the economy, but it's not prepared. We didn't have enough beds and masks and gowns and ventilators and respirators and ICU beds, etc. So we flattened the curve. We didn't want too many people to get sick too quickly. All of them rushed to the hospital. That made sense to me. It's too bad that was the case. We've had pandemics before. I wish we'd had a national project to have in storage all of that capacity. We didn't. I bet going forward we'll have a lot more capacity. Maybe we'll even have some companies that know you're on standby. If we have an emergency, you know how to shift to production really fast. So we may be better prepared for the next one. In this case, though, we waited until March. There was one death in the US on March 1st. And then the first few days, maybe even that whole first week of March, there were only 3 or 4 a day. I watched real carefully. And then in the second week, March 8th or so, it started to go to 8 or 10 or 12 a day. And in the third week, March 15th, it bumped up to 30 or 40 or 50 a day. And now we're already in hundreds a day. And we're probably going to get to thousands a day, God forbid. So at what point the president is asking, and many other scholars and thinkers and pundits are asking, and political people, will families be ruined? Will there be depression, suicide, broke? You can't get back into the economy. We'll have physical destruction. And the way they think about it, and I think that the guard against this is correct, it's not the flu. It's much more contagious than the flu. We don't have any antivirals for this. I get all that. So this is more scary and more dangerous. But it's still the morbidity rate, the death rate, is probably going to be around 1%, maybe a little higher. It depends on whether you're elderly and immunosuppressed or compromised. But for many Americans, they won't die. It's not the Black Plague. So I made peace with the fact that we were a little late to shut everything down, that we wound up shutting everything down and hurting the economy very badly, and the virus still got out a lot, and we probably still are overwhelming our healthcare system, but maybe we had to do it because we just weren't prepared enough at the healthcare level.
All right, same question to you, Dr. Croson. Can we be too cautious right now?
Yes, I think it's very easy to be too cautious. And it's not so much that we should be incredibly optimistic this is all going to be over by Easter. I don't think that's going to happen. But when we're talking about being cautious, it's not just what we know, it's how we act on our knowledge, which really matters. And so, we've really gone to the mattresses on this one, right? We've said, look, we're going to go in and shut everybody up and try to protect everybody as much as possible. And we are, putting 99 people out of work for every one person who would otherwise die. I'm glad I'm not a policymaker, so I don't have to make tough choices like that. But I am an economist, so I have to analyze the numbers. And I say, gee, it's really expensive to have 99 people out of work for every one person you save. Could we maybe loosen that up a little bit so we have only 15 people out of work for every person that we save? That would save 85% of the cost of the shutdown. And I bet you that as we go forward, we're going to get enough information about who we actually need to protect and what we need to have shut down, as opposed to just a blanket nationwide type of policy. I mean, the governor of the state of Texas, for example, said Texas is a big state, which is certainly true, and that one-size-fits-all policies would not work very well in Texas. And I'm thinking that one-size-fits-all policies don't work very well at the United States level either. It needs to be local decision-making with smart local people taking the choices, in their own hands and making their own decisions at the county or city level about what needs to be done, as opposed to having a sweeping, totally federal response.
Nolan,
go ahead, Larry.
Sorry, just quickly. Economists also like to talk about other costs that are harder to measure, but they're important. I was clamoring for people to be called to unity and service. It could be anything. Help the elderly and drop food off outside their door. Or could we all gather in the desert and build some beds and tents and capacity? I know businesses are stepping up and doing a lot. I know people are being very generous. I wanted the president or the national leadership to figure out some way for us all to go to war like we did in World War II. We were basically asked to stay on our couch. I get that we needed to be socially distant. I get all that, but I still wish there had been a way. and maybe there still is, to call us to some project or spirit of caring for our country, and obviously with care so we don't give each other the infection. But I think that was missing.
I would 100% agree with that. So after the 1918 flu, there was a great need for able-bodied people who had the flu and who had recovered from it to help and volunteer in hospitals and things like that. And very few people actually showed up. Very few people actually volunteered in that situation. I don't want to repeat that mistake of 100 years ago, right? If I had coronavirus and I was sick as a dog for 2 weeks and then I came out of it, I would hope that I would jump out and volunteer. And I say, look, I have a new superpower. I'm immune to further infection. I'm not going to infect anybody. I can go and work with the elderly. I would hope that there would be tens or hundreds of thousands of volunteers like that. And I would hope that some elder statesman or another will make this point publicly in the next couple of weeks and say, you have an opportunity to do a historic favor for the United States, and that people will rise to the occasion.
And maybe provide some some educational incentives to go into healthcare and things like that. Certainly caretakers, people like that are going to be absolutely essential in the coming, well, they're going to be needed anyway just because of demographics. Right. But this will accelerate that.
But, if a bus needed to be driven, I would drive a bus, right, in order to help the effort, right? Mm-hmm. It's really incumbent upon people who are able to do difficult things to actually step up and do them at the right time.
And
Nolan, you want to get in here?
Yeah, Nolan, maybe this is the moment where maybe it's voluntary. I'm not a big believer in top-down government, but maybe it's voluntary. But students who have debt, we're going to wipe out some of your debt. If you join the Service Corps, the coronavirus, post-virus Service Corps, there could be a lot of ideas to bring this country together, relieve people of their debt, help them get on their feet, but mostly improve the spirit and unity of the country.
Well, can we call it the Civilian Conservation Corps, please?
Yes.
Well, I think that was unconstitutional, but we're going to give it another try.
Just an idea. Again, some implicit quantification. There's been a lot of discussion about $15 an hour being a living wage. And, it is in most places which are not horrendously expensive to live in. That translates to about $30,000 annually. You can do a lot with $30,000 if you're currently earning nothing, right? And so, I think that we should think about that sort of as a reference point and say, nobody's going to get rich off of getting $30,000 from volunteering, but $30,000 is a lot to somebody who's been unemployed or who needs to put a roof over their head or needs to have steady income. And so, I don't propose that these be $100,000 jobs, but they can definitely pay something.
Gentlemen, I think we can all agree that Boeing and AT&T, Apple, and virtually all the major corporations in America, they're going to come out of this just fine. Well, they're going to come out of this and survive at the very least. But a lot of small businesses, we can't say the same thing about. They're going to struggle, and many will go under. I know it's hard to say right now because we're only 3 weeks into this or so. But let's say best case and worst case here. The impact on small business. What do you think, Dr. Croson?
Well, it's pretty grim. I mean, for small businesses which have 25 employees or fewer, this is basically a death sentence. They're not well capitalized enough. They don't have access to the debt markets. They've got maybe 2 months worth of cash in the bank, and their demand has basically dropped to zero for most of these businesses, unless they happen to be in a lucky sector. And on top of that, some states are telling them it's against the law to actually have your employees come to work. And so, if one wanted to extinguish a lot of small businesses in the United States, this would be the type of policy I would pick. Now, of course, I don't think anybody really wants that, right? It's just an unintended consequence of trying to protect the public health. But I think that small businesses are going to be on the critical list here. We're going to see a lot of failures. And it's well documented that newly formed businesses that are 5 years out or fewer, contribute to almost all of the net job growth in the United States. It's not necessarily that they stay small. Some of them grow pretty rapidly. But those new businesses are going to take, multiple mortal wounds during this shutdown process. And it's not even so much that they're going to be affected by the virus or the fear. They're going to be affected by the shutdown, right, which is going to basically strangle them. And so I really, really hope that there's going to be some kind of relief for those small businesses, perhaps beyond a handout, that will enable them to stay on life support and eventually recover, as opposed to joining the ranks of ex-small businesses, people who were successful for a while but then ran into a lot of difficulty. I mean, it would be tragic for the U.S. economy and for our society if lots of small businesses went broke at the same time.
And Mr. Greenfield, when you discuss this, I'd like you to maybe throw in I know you're in Los Angeles, or your practice is there, so I wouldn't mind hearing it. Have you noticed anything firsthand there in LA? It's certainly not like New York or what happened in Washington State, but California is, that's a hot spot, as they say. Talk about that in your answer, if you can, please.
Sure. On the first point, while banks are in better shape than they were in the financial crisis of 2008, a lot of other Americans had just started their job creation and their new businesses and their increasing wages. And we've had a pretty good run in the economy. So it's a really bad blow for a lot of people to now be thrown out of their job or their job path or their career path. I think landlords are going to get hurt at a significant level in the commercial and even residential markets. So that's bothering me. The real estate market, I think, is going to struggle for quite a while. California is a mess. It's not. It already was struggling with homelessness and some disunity and some middle-class families feeling the pinch from high taxes and regulation. Do you know, Nolan, that at the end of 2019, there was a new law which was hurting the gig economy, that they weren't allowing you to be an independent contractor. So it was hurting, Uber drivers, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think California's, as it often does, by the way, in recessions, is going to feel a big blow. Yeah.
Larry, you work in investments, and your clients, I will say, they've done very well in the market, certainly in the last 3 or 4 years. What are you advising the people that invest with you or have invested with you? What would you advise them right now? Would you say to people who might be afraid to buy back into the market that's been very volatile and has lost nearly 25% of its value in the last 2 or 3 weeks? What would you advise them in these very uncertain times?
So, Nolan, it's always case by case. If you're younger, the market's much cheaper and you're going to be investing for a long time. So thank God you're not going to be buying out of your paycheck, your small contribution into your retirement plan at world record all-time high prices. So for anybody who's 40 or younger, this is your chance to be saving if you're working and back to work. Mm-hmm. And so you want a low market. When the market was low in 2008, when it was low in 1987, when it was low multiple other times, putting money to work at a low made sense. If you're older and your retirement savings are much lower, you're nervous. Probably the wrong thing to do generically. Everybody needs to be discussed this with case by case. But if you're older and you're nervous and you're worried about the virus and the economy and your savings, then you need to be diversified and maybe have sold a little bit on the way down. Hopefully you sold a little bit on the way up and took some profits at the market all-time high. There were people, by the way, lots of people, who were gently selling on the way up as they got older. Naturally, one should reallocate one's portfolio into less risky assets as one gets older. A lot of people do that. And a lot of advisors had people not quite as vulnerable to a market correction, at this point beyond a correction, 35% at its low. Today was a good day, so now we're at 30 or 28% off of the highs. The highs were probably puffed up anyways. Remember, the market is only now back down to 2018 or 2017 levels. You didn't lose all your money. And if you need it to sleep or you need it to live, then on a rally, you might want to lighten up and reallocate and be more conservative so you're not so vulnerable now and forever to the market.
All right, so David, you've heard what Larry said. Is there anything that the average person can do that, say, a year from now or 5 years from now, they can look back and say, hey, that was a wise decision. I was really glad I did that?
So I think a year from now is a little bit too short a time frame in order to look at. But I think on the 5-year level, you want to make sure that you're diversified not only within your equity portfolio but across asset classes. And so normally, we say, you want it to be mostly in equities when you're younger and mostly in fixed income when you're older. Right now, fixed income is paying next to nothing, right? Anybody who chased high yield really got their head handed to them, right, in the recent correction. And it's really hard to justify holding 10-year treasury notes, which, yield, 0.5%, right? The effective yield went negative at some point today, which I thought was really interesting, right? And so I would say if you're younger in particular, rotating some of your asset allocation from bonds into stocks gradually, maybe over the next year, makes a lot of sense, right? Increasing your allocation to stocks by 5 or 10%. You'll be really glad that you did this. You're taking advantage of the opportunity to make a few monthly investments at low rates. And 5 years from now, you'll say, gee, I'm glad that I bought when I did.
So, Nolan, I would conclude by saying diversification is really important. So own lots of different types of assets, hopefully that aren't all correlated to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Number 2, be more conservative as you get older. That's really important so you don't run out of money. Number 3, take advantage of opportunity when you can, especially if you're younger. You'll be glad you bought if 5 years from now things are a lot better and a lot higher. Don't panic. Think about your time horizon and your objectives and your risk tolerance. Know what you own. Consult with a financial advisor. Don't play this game alone at home. Pay attention. Don't panic. This is not the Black Plague. We're not all going to die. And so be thoughtful. I think those are basics. I don't want to go into any further specifics because it all matters individually, but I think it's safe to say that's prudent financial literacy for everybody.
All right, Larry, you're on a roll, so I'm going to give you a softball here, but I'm going to hold you to a 1-minute timer, okay? 1 minute, because I know that I've heard you give these political speeches, and the tape runs out. So I will give you a minute, though, to speak, because you brought this up earlier, and we were discussing this, and I know you're very suspicious of the Chinese, and you've embraced many of the planks of former Trump advisor Steve Bannon. He talks about economic nationalism, and that's really the policy in the White House right now. It's economic nationalism, America first, and whatever you think about that. And I know you're in that camp to some degree. You certainly have your toes in that pool. When he talks about economic nationalism, this is a strange time to be in because this is a global pandemic, and it does require cooperation, trade routes. We get a lot of supplies from not just China, but Asia and throughout the world. So won't we become more really dependent upon a global economy and those supply lines, and maybe even potentially labor at some point? If we have a shortage of, say, medical staff, we may have to loosen immigration to invite more doctors in and medical staff. Talk about what we used to call economic nationalism now with the new crisis in the day and age of the coronavirus pandemic.
Right. And I think this conversation about globalism and interdependence versus economic nationalism and independence and sovereignty and make and build America. You know, Congress passed laws in, I think, 1933 and again in 1983 called Buy America or Make American. And I think what Trumpism partly was about was, look, the Chinese make almost all of the medicine and drugs we use. Is that a good idea? They kind of lie and cheat and steal in the way they conduct their international economic policy. Is that okay with us? We don't have a lot of manufacturing base in the United States, or we lost a lot of it. Maybe we should grab a lot of it back. Maybe that's a good idea. I think a lot of the elements of Trumpism, border security, not letting in unvetted refugees. If you go through the list of Trump policies from day one.
Stay on topic, Larry. Stay on topic. Coronavirus only, please.
Okay, so.
I have to put the buzzer on you.
Fair enough. So do I think we're in a globalized world? Yes. Should we have goodwill and trade with other countries? Yes. Do I think one of the lessons of being vulnerable to not having our own supply chain on medicine is that we need to do that more in the United States? Yes.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the answer and the concise way you put that at the end. David, any thoughts there?
Well, I mean, trade in general is a good thing. I've always been amazed at the willingness of Chinese manufacturers to ship us all sorts of amazing things, which we can buy very cheaply, and to take these, green pieces of paper in return, right? And as the yields on these green pieces of paper go down and they're holding them, right, it's becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper for us to have purchased those things in the past, right? And so in that respect, I think we came out ahead, even though, as Larry pointed out, the terms of trade were not always completely fair and balanced, right, going forward. I do think that there's a trade-off between creating value and capturing value, though. And you need to play that trade-off effectively. You can't be focused entirely on being a global citizen and trying to make the world a better place, because you won't have a whole lot of that stick to your own country and benefit your own country, right? On the other hand, you can't be completely isolationist and economically nationalist. You can collect 100% of it, but it won't be very big. And so, we have the saying in entrepreneurship that says it's much better, to have half of a watermelon than 100% of a grape, right? And I want us to be able to find that trade-off and say, look, we need to be careful. We need to defend what we need to bring in. And our economy is a little bit fragile right now. We have to be a little bit more us-oriented. I completely endorse that idea. But let's not miss out on the huge opportunities to actually work together. There are some things that the Chinese economy is much better at than the U.S. economy is. They should be doing those things, and we should be paying them for it.
All right, this will be the last question I'll have before we get into our lightning round. So, David, you'll get the first word here, and then you'll close it out here, Larry. Let's talk about the Fed, because that's such a fundamental part about a very important element of what we're talking about when we talk about the economy. And the Fed has essentially said that they'll back everything that we do, whatever it takes with an infusion of cash to keep liquidity in markets, as well as to ensure Americans who have been panicking. I mean, there have been run on the banks and taking out a lot of money out of ATMs, and there is a certain panic that set in. And what I've seen from the Fed is they've assured, the banks are fine and this and that. Of course, they've said that before, but you have to believe the security is there. But at some point, it's going to be time to pay back the loans, the stimulus, and all this is going to cost somebody down the road somewhere. Someone has to pay the cost of all of this. And I don't just mean the medical cost or when it comes to the shutdown and all the stimulus, it's, as we've heard, maybe as much as $6 trillion. So who ends up holding the bag or paying the bill for this? It's going to be a shared, obviously a shared sacrifice, but really who are we talking about, David?
Well, that's a complicated question. I mean, basically all of, macroeconomics and public finance is about this. So as I mentioned, that $6 trillion is the initial amount which is being invested. If this were all given to a business and it affected the business's profitability and 28% of it came back as a statutory tax, right, we would kind of take that 20% off the top. Similarly, if it creates jobs and it improves employment and it makes people's lives better, that will come back into the government coffers eventually over a long period of time. So, that $6 billion is kind of like saying, well, I went and bought $6 trillion rather. I went and bought an apartment building for $6 trillion. But the reason why you did it was you wanted to collect rent month by month over a long period of time. You can't look at the $6 trillion without also looking at the cash flows that come back in, right? So I'd like to see some dynamic calculations of saying it's going to be $6 trillion up front, but how long will it take us to break even, to recoup? What's going to be our internal rate of return on that $6 trillion? I'd love to see some transparency about that. So, that being said, when the Fed puts money into the system, even though we talk about trillions of dollars, right? 1.5 trillion was put into the, money supply last week. People get very confused about what the Fed is doing. The Fed is not spending that money the same way that Congress is proposing to spend that money. They're simply making it available. Some of it has to be repaid in a day. Some has to be repaid in a week, some in a month, some in 3 months. That's very different from fiscal policy, where you say that money is going to float out there like bread upon the waters, and we're going to hope that it's going to return to us after many days. And so they are dollars, they are trillions of dollars, but those two are very, very different economic policies. And so, for the $6 trillion which is being spent, the people who are going to pay for it are people who are taking lower interest rates on government debt. They used to earn 1.5%, now they're going to earn 0.5%, right now. And I would say, don't be one of those people. Right? See if you can avoid actually paying for the year or 2 or 3 that it'll take for the government to recoup that $6 trillion. And the way to do that is not be holding U.S. Treasuries. right? Rotate into equities, rotate into something else. That's where the payment happens, more so than taxes, more so than, individuals who are actually dealing with it. It comes from getting, lower rates of return on capital over the next couple of years. And so in that respect, as we know, the wealthiest, few percent of the people own a good deal of the wealth. That cost is falling disproportionately on the people with high assets.
Larry, the question was about the Fed and who's going to end up paying the bill.
Just a short answer to build. And Nolan, I think you're going to be happy with this answer. We built up the military in the first 3 years of the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect no matter who's the next president, we will not be having $750 billion military budgets. They're going to take a chunk of the expenditure outlay every year going forward and spread it around. We will not be initiating new aircraft carriers for a while.
Wow, what an interesting close there. And we're going to get into our lightning round, which we're going to pick up on that now. That's very good, Larry. And David, thank you very much. Gentlemen, we're going to get to our lightning round now. It's basically you're going to get, let's say 15 seconds, all right? I know you're going to go 30, but let's try to keep it at 15 or 20 or 30 at the very most. Questions to both of you. David, you're going to go first because I understand a PhD it outranks a law degree.
Yes, it does.
It took a little longer.
Harvard, Georgetown, that's close. But anyway.
He outranks me there too.
All right, so the first question on our lightning round, gentlemen, Dr. Croson, are we headed, yes or no, and a reason why or why not, are we headed for the big D? Are we headed for a Great Depression?
I don't think so. I don't even think we're going to have 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. We're not going to have much of a recession, if any. And we have been set back by about 2 years, but I don't see that there is anything structural about the economy that would prevent us from grinding our way back. It won't be a really sharp V, but I don't think that we have to deal with huge amounts of, economic losses and negative growth for a long period of time. And, I would love to be right.
Your sir, Larry.
Yeah, I agree. We didn't lose incredible assets and buildings. We didn't lose incredible scientific talent. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a Holocaust. We didn't have an end to the energy grid. In fact, there will probably be creativity that comes out of this, maybe even some productivity. And I don't think we'll have a depression, no.
Good. Good news. Good news from the experts. I'd like to hear that answer. Let's talk about the deficit, which was already at a record high for this country, 23 trillion. The numbers are astronomical. That's going to go much higher now. What will the deficit be 2 years from now? You could say 3 years, 5 years. What will the deficit be like in the future, and how consequential is that to our long-term destiny? David?
Well, I think it's going to be higher no matter who ends up, holding the Oval Office. I think that no matter what happens, we're going to have repercussions from all of this spending. It's going to need to be recouped. Businesses are going to be slow to increase their profits. They have a lot of write-offs that they're going to be taking over the next couple of years on their taxes. And so I think we're going to dig ourselves further into a hole. The U.S. national debt is $200+ trillion, however. And so that's about the only number that I know that's higher than the 6 trillion we're talking about here. It's going to be a couple of percent drag. It's not going to be massively huge.
There will be bankruptcies at the individual level. I'm not sure about municipalities. The U.S. funded liabilities are very high. So are state governments. We are an aging population. We may have a baby boom, which will be great for the long run. So the only thing I can say about the debt, it'll be higher, but it's being financed at really low interest rates. And I think we would all predict interest rates will stay lower longer. They already were low for a really long time. And boy, anybody who bet on higher and higher interest rates soon and eventually put off that bet. It's going to take a long time.
Mm-hmm. All right, gentlemen. So regardless of your politics, think about this now. We have an election coming up. We assume it's still going to happen in November of 2020. Can you imagine or can you fathom how difficult the situation is going to be? Regardless of your politics, left, right, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, how difficult it's going to be for the president the next president, whether that's Trump reelected or Biden or someone else, to assume the office, all of the mess that they're going to inherit when they come into office in next January of 2021. I mean, can you even fathom who would want this job and cleaning up this mess? Talk about the politics of this year, what we're going into, and who in their right mind would be able to clean up such a mess. David?
Well, we've had almost this exact conversation before in 2008. I remember remarking at the time, I said, look, it's clear that Barack Obama could be president for any 8 years during his life that he wanted to. Why is he picking these 8 years, right, from 2008 to 2017? He came in, he inherited a mess. Some of it got turned around, right? Some of it continued to be very chaotic during that time. I think that, I'm cautiously optimistic, whether it's President Trump getting reelected or a newcomer coming in, that they'll have an easier time over the next 4 years getting solidarity and unity out of the place, which has not been very pronounced in the last 4 years. But it's going to be a big challenge. And I'd like to hope that if the administration is going to change, that they leave it, they leave it in an orderly fashion, that their activities are well documented, and that it's possible to hand over without a whole lot of chaos happening. And if the administration continues on, right, is reelected, that they will get some support from the American people, recognizing that it's 4 more years and only 4 more years, following which there will be a changing of the guard.
Larry?
Well said. I would say whoever becomes president, and both parties and candidates as they approach November of 2020 could, if they were clever, offer the following. The next administration needs to be bipartisan. And I will make sure my cabinet and my appointments and my policies are less ideological than they might otherwise would have been.
I think that would be a very reasonable pledge. It'll never happen, but it sounds quite sensible.
Bernie Sanders and Mitt Romney, I'm good with that.
Well, I think we have seen this theme that says that, we need to all hang together or else we'll all hang separately, right? Yeah. It's going to be incredibly important that people come together and agree on common goals. I'm not sure that I'm seeing that on Facebook necessarily, but I'd really love to see it in the American population as a whole, where people will hang together and pull together, regardless of political party, race, religion, creed, etc. I think if we can accomplish that, we might actually come out ahead with the whole COVID crisis, right, as rekindling the spirit of national unity, which has been sorely lacking in the past decade or two.
Oh, that's excellent. What a beautiful silver lining that is that you both brought to the really the end of the discussion. Now, our final segment will be some of the questions that were posted on Facebook. What happened about an hour or so before we came on the air and started recording here, I asked if anybody had questions, and of course, being Facebook and being all 3 of us are, I guess, somewhat controversial, there were a number of questions. But let me get to the 3 questions I thought were really profound. A lot of people would like to. So excuse me for looking down. I'm having to read off the screen here. But this is from Bruce, who he wrote, I'll just read it how he wrote it here. Is Trump gambling on reopening the economy so soon that he truly doesn't believe this pandemic is a thing? Are his personal interests, his hotels, resorts, mostly shut, and not making any profits for his organization, going to be the deciding factor and not science? Obviously, there's a slant here where he's going, but what he's talking about is there have been some accusations against Trump, and he's acting in his own self-interest, maybe in the interest of the Fortune 500 and so forth and so on. It's a politically slanted question, but it's a valid one. Larry, let me let you start off first.
I think what will happen is we'll start to lighten up on the lockdown period, and in little pieces, in sections, maybe where it's not a hot zone and there aren't any virus cases, or parts of the economy, we'll do little test cases. So we'll gently roll the lockdown, not all at once. Not everybody go to the beach, go to the movies, go to the concert, go to the ball game. In bits and pieces, small, little steps. Restaurants you may open, but please seat people far away from each other, and work on takeout more than dining in, and for limited hours. And you've got to test your temperature on the way in. And school kids, you can come in today, but we're going to test you first before you come in. So bits and pieces.
Another,
So
yeah, go ahead,
I
David.
would say, yeah, I would say, hotels are sort of the temperature of the U.S. economy at this point. The hotel business is tough enough anyway. A lot of hotels are very highly leveraged, and they have very high operating leverage. Their profits go up and down very sharply with small changes in their output and their demand. And so I would agree, President Trump stands to lose quite a bit in his relatively undiversified and highly leveraged portfolio if the hotel, industry, circles the drain. On the other hand, right, the costs of those conflicts of interest happen when people who are in power take actions which are bad for the economy because of what they want for their personal portfolio. When they take actions which are good for the economy because of what they want for their personal portfolio, it can be a win-win situation. And so, I would hope that President Trump is taking into account the entire economy and not just his own holdings. But just because he does something which is going to help the hotel industry doesn't mean that's going to hurt the economy because he does it.
And by the way, Nolan,
go ahead, Larry.
When you're in a hotel room, you're still sort of self-quarantined. That happens to be a sector that I don't think is the most irresponsible to sort of begin to open up.
Sure. And business travel, right, needs to come back, and people need to be able to, go to the opposite coast for sales meetings and things like that. Zoom does a great job for what it does, but, actually being there in person is complementary to face-to-face interaction.
We had another question on Facebook. Unfortunately, I have to revise it a little bit here. It's from Glenn. He's asking about a depression, and we discussed that a little bit. You both said that we probably won't have 2 consecutive quarters of negativity, and so you both said that you're probably not headed for a depression. But let me rephrase this question a little bit. Most of us can remember the pain of the 2008 crisis. It took us, almost a decade to get out of. Certainly, it took us two years of adjustments to get out of. Just getting back to normal on your mortgage, and a lot of things. Construction was down and all that. So it took us a long time to recover from the 2008 crash. Let's compare this. I know we're in the middle of it. It's hard to say how long it's going to last. But 2008, would you rather take that crisis, or would you rather be stuck where we are right now?
I can start off with this. So I'd much rather be where we are right now. We are dealing with a scientific and medical problem. It's severe. We don't know as much about it as we'd like to, but we can make great leaps and bounds in knowledge about how to deal with it relatively quickly, as opposed to having to restructure the whole darn economy. But during the 2008 crisis, the S&P 500 went down to like 750. We're now complaining that it's gone down to 2,300, right, or 2,100. We are nowhere close to the bottoms that we saw in 2008. And so, comparing these two, I think is a little bit premature. This is kind of like the first summer when the financial crisis was just beginning. At this point, only if this turns into a prolonged shutdown or a really, really, serious high death rate pandemic situation will we get to that level of criticality.
I agree. The loss of houses alone in 08, 09, 07, 08, 09 was devastating. David, actually, I know this because of the number. The S&P at its lowest moment hit 666.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
March 9th was the low for the markets, March 9th, 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're, 11 years? And it's possible, let's cross our fingers,
Mm-hmm.
that yesterday, Monday, March 23, 2020 was the low. It's possible we're going to test that low or go even lower. But for the moment, the low wasn't even close to that number. Yeah.
Right. And so, I think we should just be aware that 2008 financial crisis was like a slow motion train wreck. People knew that bad things were coming, and they just kept coming and coming and coming and coming and coming. At least in this type of market, there are some up days in the middle where people become a little more optimistic when some cash is freed up and there's some buying which happens. As we see, once people become more confident that the federal government has its act together and can put together a reasonable stimulus bill, people are going to start recommitting money to it. So as I said, I think that losing 2 years of economic growth is a really big deal. This is not something I would advocate a steady diet of, but we have lots of years left, in order to make up for that loss of 2 years. And I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll look back on this 10 years from now and say that was a pretty bad time, but we got through it.
You know, that's a great point, and it leads to our final question from a person on Facebook. It's from Chick Natkins. He says, and I'm not sure where he's getting this information, but this is what he says or writes. Word from Wall Street is that no one is lending right now. Will the bailout unfreeze funds in the short term, or will hedge funds continue to be ultra cautious for the next 6 months?
Well, you know, predictions are hard, especially ones about the future, as Niels Bohr used to say. I think I know why hedge funds are being, you know, really cautious about lending. People who had leveraged loan funds really got hurt. There are a number of REITs which are finding that they can't meet their margin calls now, and they may have to go into liquidation. And right now, although the cost of borrowing is peanuts, right, the cost of processing those loans and vetting the people who are being, you know, who are doing the borrowing and so on hasn't gone anywhere. And if anything, it's become more difficult because you can't fly out and talk to them, right? So I think that, you know, the loan market is kind of seized up right now, but, you know, hopefully we'll be able to relax it in the next 3 months or so that that cheap money can start flowing through the system.
Yeah, the Fed is doing a lot to buy corporate bonds and otherwise make short-term monies available to banks and others in the economy. Things will improve. I was wondering, David has some expertise on refinance and that whole subject. And so I wondered if he could make a policy idea.
Well, this was just an idea that I thought about. So, you know, right, I own a house, right? I have a mortgage. I noticed that rates fell, and, you know, you would think that mortgage rates would be falling too. They are, but not very fast, apparently, because everybody wants to refinance at the same time. Does that sound familiar? But, you know, when I ran the numbers on refinancing my mortgage, I said, gee, I have to buy title insurance all over again. Even though I got a title policy a few years ago, even though I've been in the house the whole time, no shenanigans like renting it out or, you know, selling it to a corporation or things like that. Wouldn't it be nice if it were possible for some entity, possibly, you know, HUD or somebody like this, to step in and offer sort of a bridge title insurance policy for refinancing during this time, saying for people who are in the ordinary situation where they would qualify, so that these lower interest rates can go into effect, so that people can have lower monthly payments on their house, so that they'll have more money to spend in the economy or more money to invest in their retirement, right? Or more money for everything. Right now, I think everything is crawling along because there's a lot of sand in the gears. And this would be a great opportunity for, you know, the federal level government to step in and do what it does best, which is to say, we'll stand behind things in order to get the economy back on track. This is probably not the first time somebody suggested that idea, but it seems like an idea whose time has come.
And possibly even with home equity lines of credit, you need to have a lot of income.
Sure.
So maybe they'll lower the regulatory burden on you.
Yeah,
with how
that
much
would help
income.
quite a bit, right? You know, making smaller amounts of money available to just about everybody who has a home would do a lot more for freeing up the economy than mailing them checks.
All right, gentlemen, final question. We'll just do this in hopefully, again, 15 seconds or so. Our final word, a silver lining to the crisis. We talked about a little bit earlier. We discussed that, but I think I'd like to leave, if we can, leave on a positive note. We'd like to walk away from this not only wiser, but maybe more optimistic. Which one of you gentlemen would like to talk about the silver linings of the coronavirus crisis?
I'll be happy to jump in. So people are at home. So let's talk about people being at home. People are actually having conversations with their spouses and their kids. They're catching up on their reading and cleaning out the garage. I suspect in 9 months we'll have a baby boom. And I bet a lot of the boys' names will be Noah, as if we were on the ark. And maybe the girls' names will be Coratina, like Corantina. So, I mean, it's up to every individual to decide to try to make the best of a real bad scenario. Mm-hmm. And if you have a positive attitude, we know in life, you live longer, you're healthier, and you probably do better economically.
Mm-hmm.
David?
Right. So I'm all for that kind of optimism. I would echo something that Larry said before, which is that especially if one is relatively young and still growing in one's earning capability, being able to invest small amounts of money and compound over long periods of time is tremendously valuable. And being able to put money in and not be worried that we're going to have this type of correction that we've seen in the short run is very powerful, right? I would also add that, this type of pandemic, right, a virus that, comes out of nowhere and catches us unaware, is likely to have occurred sometime in the next 2 decades anyway, right? We're kind of making a down payment on something that previously we might have avoided and put off a little bit further in the future. But I'd like to think that once we've suffered it, we're going to get some credit in the future when either we get a replay of this scenario, or it'll turn out that, we dealt with it in 2020 rather than in 2026. And so there will be a hidden benefit from avoiding a problem down the road. It may take us a while to actually realize that. But, wouldn't it be amazing if we ended up with a cure for the common cold out of this? I mean, there's more than one kind of coronavirus out there. And if we made progress towards, reducing the amount of work which is lost just from people having random viral illnesses over the next several decades, that would be a huge increase in social welfare, even though it was birthed in pain and, potentially economic losses in 2020.
Excellent. Well, I will say, gentlemen, that my silver lining, at least, is that I got to do a show with 2 distinguished guests here, Larry Greenfield and Dr. David Croson. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me and being the debut guest on this show. And so it was really a pleasure, and I learned a lot. And I hope that the viewers there, this will be posted on YouTube, and we'll certainly post it on Facebook, and it'll stay up for a while. And maybe it'll all be obsolete in a month. We'll have to do another one. We'll see. So I want to thank again Dr. David Croson and Larry Greenfield. I'm Nolan Dalla here in Las Vegas. Thank you for tuning in. Please feel free to follow any or all of us, hopefully, on Facebook. Nolan Dalla, you can see Larry Greenfield, David Croson. And we welcome your comments, your thoughts, and your questions, and maybe even if you have an idea for a future discussion, we would certainly entertain that. So thank you very much. I'm signing off here, and good night.
Thanks, Nolan.